Okay.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to do the introduction. It's a great pleasure to introduce Alex. So most of you know him, of course. He's one of the co-founders of datavisyn, and Alex is doing his sabbatical at datavisyn and also at Johannes Kepler University, Linz here. And so I know Alex for a long time. So we basically did our PhD together at Graz University of Technology. We shared the same office and we worked on Kaleido, which kind of is why we have datavisyn today. And then Alex moved to Harvard and he started as a postdoc in Hans-Peter Pista's group. And finally, he moved to University of Utah to start as an assistant professor there. And recently he got promoted to associate professor. And Alex is going to show us some of his recent work, and many of you will have plenty of opportunity to talk to Alex over the next year. So Alex, I guess that's it. So the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. So hi, everybody. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. My goal for today is to give you a little bit of an introduction into like the type of research that I do, and then do like a deep dive into a project that I call Literate Visualization. And I just want to give a shout out ahead of time to Kiran, Gadav, and Zach, who also just, or is about to join datavisyn, who have been kind of like the main students doing this work at Utah. And also there's long collaboration with Mark and Niels and Sam that I'll also be talking about. But let me kick this all off with like my obligatory slide. This is our research group at Utah, the Visualization Design Lab. We're like 2 faculty, like between 6 and 8 PhD students, and then like a diverse set of undergraduates or master students that participate in the lab and lab activities. And this is from our most recent outing, this picture here. So today, like, let me start with like a bit of an introduction into visualization itself. So the purpose of computing is insight, not numbers, is a quote that I really like by Richard Hamming. And again, nobody would really dispute this quote. But if you just slightly modify it, you get to the purpose of visualization is insight, not pictures. And again, that sounds super reasonable, but in practice, it might not be quite as common and well understood as you would think. And especially in scientific publications, you very often see visualizations that are meant to like pretty up a publication instead of actually communicating data well and efficiently. And so my favorite example for this is this data set of these plant species. So we have 6 different plant species: the banana, the date, cress, rice, sorghum, and brome. And scientists want to study the evolutionary relationship between those plant species. And the way they used to do this is to like plot this in what I call the infamous banana Venn diagram or similar Venn diagrams. And so this is actually a terrible, terrible chart. And the reason why it's so bad is that it really doesn't like leverage anything that's useful about visualization. So let me give you an example. There's like this tiny little segment up here on the left that has like 1,151 shared genes between like a set of plants. But right next to it, there is another one that only has 40 shared genes, and they're exactly of equal prominence. So there's no relationship between how prominent something is on the screen and how important it is actually in the data. So clearly this chart is problematic. Similarly, down here, we have like a gigantic segment, very prominent on the screen, that represents only 105 shared genes. So I would argue that a table would actually have been a better approach to visualize this. This is unfortunately not an isolated incident. These high set Venn diagrams are very common. You see one for the pine on the top left. This on the top right is supposed to be like a mouse, and then you have some like mouse, fly, worm, yeast, human Venn diagram on the bottom left. And so we kind of like set out back in 2014 thinking about, can we do better? Can we solve this problem? Can we create a better visualization that can visualize this data efficiently? And so we came up with this idea for this technique that we call upset. And so the basic idea is that, like here on the right, I show you like the corresponding Venn diagram. On the left, I'm building up this upset plot. And the basic idea is to plot the sets in columns. So you have like a column A corresponding to set A, a column B corresponding to set B, column C corresponding to set C. And then in this matrix, I'm adding the rows that correspond to the intersection. So the first one is not in any of the sets. The second one is just in A, not in B, not in C. Then we have like a combination of A and B, and a combination of A and C, and finally a combination of B and C, and then eventually the intersection of all of the three sets. And so now we have like this linear layout of this kind of like these intersections in the Venn diagram. And what I can do now is, by using this linear layout, this matrix, I can now very efficiently plot attributes about those intersections. So I can like plot using a bar chart, plot the size of these intersections, which is also called the cardinality. And so here I can immediately spot, well, the largest intersection is the combination of A and B. And the combination of A, B, and C still has 5 elements. So it's very easy to actually read something from this chart. And like, of course, now I have to show you how the banana Venn diagram looks like if you plot it with an upset plot. And it turns out that this is now actually a useful chart. So the first thing that you will note in this upset diagram here is that the largest intersection includes all sets. So those plants seem to have more in common than they have apart. So they clearly share evolutionary relationships. So that's kind of like the most salient feature. 7,674 genes are shared between all of the plant species. The second thing is that you will notice that there's like a group of plant species here on the left that are kind of similar. They intersect, like they have the second largest intersections between the three of them, and they also participate in this 5-set intersection that is also fairly large. So we can maybe say, wow, these 3 plant species are, like in terms of the shared genes, they're pretty similar. And then finally, we can also learn that there is like one plant species, the date, that doesn't participate in any intersection until like down the line there. So we can maybe conclude that the date here is the most dissimilar of these plant species. And now I've just like, by very quickly looking at this chart, I've reasoned about relationships in the data. I've been able to read it. I've been able to identify important patterns, which I just haven't been able to do in the Venn diagram. And of course, like what I showed you was like a static chart, but like if you have this matrix approach, you can actually use interactivity to sort, you can plot metadata, you can group, you can aggregate, you can query. So you can answer all kinds of set questions and questions related to elements and attributes and aggregates of sets with this approach. And so if you want to play with this, you can go to the link down here, vcg.github.io/upset. And I'm like happy to say that upset has fortunately become the canonical way to show set data with more than 3 sets. It is the second most cited VIS paper of the last decade. And there's multiple implementations in various languages. There is an R version that we created. There is now another R version that is even more advanced than the one we created. There is like an implementation in Tableau. There are multiple Python implementation of upset, and we haven't had a hand in those. So people like find them useful, and they re-implement them in the various languages that they use in their data analysis. So this is just like one example for what I think is kind of an interesting piece of like visualization design, but I want to give you now a little bit more of a broader overview of my research areas before I do this deep dive into this one particular topic. And so I like to think of my research classified into 3 different pillars. The first one is technical contribution. So I develop novel visualization techniques, just like the upset technique that I just talked about, but also visualization process innovations and data wrangling methods. The second pillar, which is actually very important to me, is domain-driven techniques. So my students, my group, and I, we develop tailored methods and systems for high-impact science problems. And typically, this is in collaboration with biomedical research scientists and pharmaceutical researchers. And then finally, I also do empirical and theoretical work. For example, I've recently gained an interest in an evaluation methodology for complex systems and also design spaces and taxonomy. So let me give you like one example for each of those, like the data wrangling methods. Here is like an example for like some of you might have heard of the company called Trifecta or the Data Wrangler. The tool it's based on is like a data wrangling method for tabular data. But it turns out data wrangling is also very important for network data. And so we built Origraph, this tool here, that is a data wrangling tool for network data. So you can reshape any data into like the network shape that you desire using mostly graphical methods. And that's kind of like very useful because very often the data, like the network that you have isn't really the one you need. So very frequently you want to do some transformations first. And they can be very tricky in code. And of course, not everybody can write code. And so here you have like a graphical tool that does that. An example for a domain-driven technique would be this tool lineage that we, oops, this was one click too much. Let's see. Would be this tool lineage where we worked with psychiatry researchers and geneticists that wanted to study kind of like the genetic component of suicide. And so it turns out that genetics is fairly strongly responsible for how people commit suicide. And what these researchers do, they look at large family pedigrees and study like what are the relationships between suicide cases in these families and what are the like other attributes. So for example, if you look at young female members of that family and they all committed suicide at a very young age and also had, for example, like schizophrenia diagnosed, you could probably conclude that this isn't just environmental, right? That this isn't just like a hard life or social causes, but that there's something genetic going on. And so the researchers can use our tools here to kind of like drill down into those interesting cases and then run expensive genetic analysis like shared genomic sequence analysis between those potentially interesting cases. And then finally, like an example of our empirical and theoretical work is this state-of-the-art report that Mark and I wrote together with Mariah Meyer and Carolina Nobre recently about like multivariate network visualization techniques. Okay, so with that brief introduction, now let me dive into the main topic of today, which is literate visualization, and it's about making visual analysis sessions reproducible and reusable. And so why is that important? Like reproducibility is like a big buzzword in science, and especially in psychology, but also in many biological fields, people perceive a reproducibility crisis, and many papers have been like shown to not actually reproduce. And the journal Nature ran a survey and asked scientists whether they perceive that there is a reproducibility crisis. And 52% of respondents said, yes, there is a significant crisis. And 38% said, yes, there's a slight crisis. So like a vast majority of scientists perceives there is a reproducibility crisis in science. And selected projects or selected initiatives try to replicate studies in psychology and in cancer biology. And in psychology, only 40% of experiments were like reproducible for this particular study. And in cancer biology, only 11% of all findings were reproducible based on the information found in the papers. So that's kind of not a good rate, right? This is problematic. And why is there a reproducibility crisis? Of course, there's perverse incentives, right? Like we live under this publish or perish paradigm. We have a bias for flashy and unconventional results that maybe are more likely to be wrong than like the boring results that then tend to get rejected. There are, of course, also problems in data analysis. And we're still not as good as we think we are in terms of data sharing and in sharing the analysis process. And so while some of these problems here are certainly not amenable to, let's say, technical solutions, some others are. So especially, we can actually think about what are the problems in data analysis that we can like address, especially for interactive visual data analysis. Can we do something about making this more reproducible? And for data analysis in general, for scripted data analysis, I think that we've now really adopted this paradigm of literate programming that goes back to Donald Knuth, who's like a very famous computer scientist. And he said, like literate programming is really about explaining the why and the how of a computer program by using any means necessary. So you're not supposed to write code that is understood by the computer, but it's more important to write code that is understood by your fellow human beings, because like people need to read it, need to edit it, need to understand it. And in scientific computing, in data analysis based on things like Jupyter notebooks, we use text, we use images, visualizations, we include formulas, we include videos, we have links, and we have code. And so this is also an approach to tackle problems in data analysis and enhance reproducibility. Literate programming really is meant to be able to do this. And we see this in the wild nowadays. Like basically, a great publication typically would include all of the analysis scripts in some readable format with annotations, with explanations in, for example, R Markdown or Jupyter notebooks or observable notebooks. But unfortunately, this all isn't really possible for visualization. So let's think a little bit about how literal programs are created. Like you write a draft of code that might work for a particular test case. Then you edit the code to generalize, like you take out some hard-coded stuff, you put it into a function or something like this. Then you refactor your code for readability and good software engineering practices. Then you write some of the documentation, maybe provide links to papers and so on. And then you provide context with images, links, equations, and text. So this is kind of like an involved process from like your first working prototype to having this literate program, this document that you can share that like faithfully represents your analysis. And this is like history, like version control is actually all that important here. Like the order in which you wrote the documentation isn't relevant. And so if we think about what this means for interactive visualization, we could track provenance, and tracking provenance is kind of necessary, but it doesn't get us there, right? It's just like a history of what has happened, but it's not the story that you want to later tell to make this literate, like the visualization process literate. So there is no straightforward way to do literate data visualization with the means that we have right now. And so hence there's like a lot of research needed in that space. So what do I mean by literate visual data analysis? The idea here is to make the process of an interactive visual analysis sessions like the ones we usually do here at datavisyn well-reasoned and documented. So currently we typically, like if you go to any like visualization tool, you do not have a record of what was done, but let alone why. Like we are pretty good at tracking provenance, but we don't know why a user has chosen something or has done something, right? And so what we want to do in this project is track the what, but also think about like how can we track the why any analysis steps is done, so that we can get to like this state of having literate visual data analysis similar to what we can do with computational notebooks. And so quite a long time ago, Mark, Niels, and I, and some other people, we published this tool, StrataMax, which was useful for cancer subtype analysis in Nature Methods. And as part of this process, we created analysis stories, and we wanted to make them super reproducible. So we wanted to like show every single stage in this process. And the way we did this was very, very tedious. We like took tons and tons of screenshots for every step and manually documented them. But now let's just imagine I find an error somewhere in the middle, I would have to redo everything else, right? So this is just like a very tedious process and not great. And so what we did, like this was a paper by Sam, myself, Niels, Nicola Kosgrove, and Mark. We came up with this idea for Viz stories, and we call this from visual exploration to storytelling and back again. And so here, what we want to do is we want to leverage provenance data. And in case you're not aware, like I've used this term now a couple of times, but provenance data and provenance tracking really means we want to capture a log, a record of everything that led us to a state. And the word provenance comes from the like it's mostly used in like chronology of ownership, custody, or location of a historical object. So outside of computer science, it's mostly used in the art world, where you like have the provenance of a painting, for example. And so we thought about the process. If you wanted to create something like this documentation of this analysis story we did for our Nature Methods paper, you would have these 3 different stages here: exploration, authoring, and presentation. And this would be mostly like a one way, like you can switch between exploration and authoring, but from authoring to presentation is one way. and there really aren't any kind of like great tools to support this. We would rely on standard tools for presentations like PowerPoint or Adobe Premiere to create our analysis stories. And so what we did in this project is instead replace this with like a centralized system, which we call VisStories, that tracks the provenance, but also allows us to author these visual analysis stories. And so let me show you a video. This is like a demo with the gap matter data set in like a simple scatter plot. And you can see that like we're like changing the time here that is displayed. And on the right, you have the provenance graph. So you see like all of the different interactions that were made. You can revisit them. You can actually branch off the history and so on. And so as I keep interacting with this, the provenance graph is populated and updated, and we continue to have like the history tracked in that system. But eventually, like as I said before, this isn't really like if I want to build a story out of this, this history is only like part of the process. And so what I would have to do next is to think about what are the states that I actually care about, that were actually meaningful, so that were not dead ends. And I can extract this in an authoring process. So I could just take my provenance history and extract it. And now I would have like an automatically generated timeline here, and I can clean it up because some of the states might not have been super interesting. And then there's some states that I care about. And so I could keep them. I could put in timing information so that I can even like create an automatically playing video. And then eventually I can also add annotations. So for example, I can like label, in this case, Somalia as the country that I care about, and I can add an arrow to it. And so now I can kind of like author like a stepper based story, like for example, a publication like the New York Times frequently does, where you can then later navigate through that story as a user, and it's curated and somebody has put thought into it and so on. And then finally, you can publish this story in presentation mode. And so here now you can step through this and you have this interactive story. Like you can either like put it on autoplay or you can drive it on your own. It's completely your choice, but you can also jump back in and continue the exploration at any time. And so this was a really exciting project, and we also applied it to more complicated cases, not just to this demo. We kind of like recreated the whole cancer data analysis case study that we did for this Nature Methods paper with this tool, and published it. And so this kind of like set the stage for much of the thinking that happened later along those lines. And so I think this is very important progress, but what we have solved is just the what, but not the why. Provenance still is dumb. We haven't made it any easier to capture the reasoning of people. And so we were thinking about, well, can we make this a little bit more efficient? And so this is where this project here comes in. This is about capturing user intents when brushing in scatter plots, and a project led by Kieran, but also Zach was instrumental in this paper. So first, like I'm sure everybody knows it, but just to like be certain, what is brushing? Brushing is this important interaction in visualization. It's basically just like another word for selecting items. And brushing by itself is important, but it's really more important as like a precursor operations to things like filtering, grouping, transformation, and aggregation. So whenever you want to manipulate data in visualizations, chances are that you start out with a filter with a brushing operation. And so when you can understand why people have selected something, you already have like the most important piece of information. And so I'm going to focus about understanding why people have been brushing something. And like, what is the intent when people brush? Well, intent is the user's reasons for performing a brush with the visualization. And so, like, of course, there's higher level intent, such as I want to find the compound that helps me, that helps with whatever cancer patients of that particular type recover quickly. But you could also say there's like lower level intent. For example, I want to identify outliers, or I want to identify clusters. And so we actually thought about these like data-driven intents, and we have found there are 6 different patterns that we regularly found when we like looked at what patterns are analysts actually looking for. And we found outliers, clusters, correlations, both linear and nonlinear, categories, multivariate optimization, so things like find the hotels that are a great compromise between price and distance to the city center, and then ranges. Ranges are actually surprisingly common because very often there is like domain-specific thresholds that people care about. And so now what we want to do is we want to automatically infer these intents, and we care about this because it helps us to speed up complex selection. So let's suppose I have this plot of outliers here, and like if I just select a single element here, I could actually run an algorithm, like a Clippy-like thing that says, hey, are you trying to select outliers? And then we can autocomplete the selection. And more importantly, though, is it's actually like if we know what the intent was behind the selection, we can make this more robust. So traditionally, the way brushes work is we brush based on ID. So for example, in this chart on the right, this blue cluster, the way I would store this in a system, I would say store the elements with ID 7, 9, 13, 18, and 22. And that's okay, but it's not actually great, right? Because it doesn't tell us anything about what those elements have in common. We don't know anything why this was selected. And so what we want instead is what I call a semantic selection. So instead we want to store, we brush the elements in this cluster that we calculated with k-means, which was centered at coordinates 2, 3. And if we store it like this, we can actually make the selection super robust to changes that are happening in the data set. But more importantly, it's also a higher level concept, which improves reproducibility. Right now, I know, like I can, like for example, search for like where did I brush a cluster in my provenance graph. But the real killer application is reusability. Like data changes constantly. And now if I have a visualization and I store this based on IDs, like if I add this orange point, I couldn't include it. But if I have a semantic selection, I could reasonably infer that the orange point should be part of my selection. So how do we do this? Well, we start out by looking at the selection that a user makes. And then we compute a lot of different patterns for for the data set. So we like run k-means, DB scan in many different parameterizations, regression analysis, outlier detection, skyline analysis. We run decision trees for simplified ranges. We run analysis of categorical elements. And so now we have like a very large set of pre-computed patterns. And then we match this to our initial selection. And so we do this by using a ranking approach. And in this ranking approach, we use different measures. For example, and most importantly, a Jacquard distance between my selection and the my selections and the patterns that are in the predictions. And by like ideally in this, if I have selected a cluster like this here, I would have a very high Jacquard distance for the 5 elements that are in the cluster. And so our system would very likely give you a high ranking for a cluster. And then a user would come in and say, yeah, I really wanted to select this cluster. And the user could also provide annotations with such as, I think this cluster is important because it separates these like other elements from this and so on. And so like we have now like automatically captured the semantics on a data level, and the user can provide higher level semantics in the form of annotations. And so here's how the system works. Like here I'm selecting a couple of elements. Our system runs and presents a various different pre-calculated patterns. You can explore the different trade-offs, the different patterns, and then can say, yeah, this is really what I wanted to select, and locked it in. And eventually, like you can keep doing this. Like here now, I'm selecting elements that are kind of on the edge here, and you can already see the skyline has been selected, and I can very quickly select all of the points on the skyline. So this is kind of like the idea here is like smart autocomplete that you can save and store that. And so like we ran a study, like of course as scientists, we always want to know, is this useful? And so we ran like a large crowdsourced study on do these like is it actually, does this lead to improved accuracy when we ask people in like on like prolific a crowdsourcing platform to select certain patterns? And we found that actually yes, we have like statistically significant increase of accuracy on all the tasks. initially we actually got like a negative result on our outliers, but we later found out when we inspected the provenance data of the study that this was because our outlier algorithm was not behaving well. And so we then like improved our outlier detection algorithm, ran the study for outliers again, and then we also found like a positive effect for outliers. So this is about, or hopefully about to be published in a journal. And in the meantime, we have started on like looking really at this idea of reusing interactive analysis workflow. And this is a project that Kieran and Zach are currently working on. So this is like brand new, hot off the press, more or less. And so can we now use this information to kind of like make analysis processes reusable, visual analysis process? So for example, like if you write a function in a programming language, you can just reapply this function if you update your data set, right? But you can't reapply a visual analysis workflow that easily. But now with this tool, we actually want to make this possible. So the idea here is we want to be like very close to what computational analysis can do in terms of reusing of functions. So let's think a little bit about what is computational analysis versus interactive visual analysis. And it turns out interactive visual analysis has the benefits of they're intuitive and fast, and they use human perceptual capabilities. But the downside is we kind of like need to redo the analysis every time we update a data set. And computational analysis are flexible, powerful, and reusable, but they tend to be time-consuming to create. They require that analysis can and wants to program, and it's also difficult to see what's in the data if you're working purely computationally. So what we're suggesting is that we can capture workflows based on interactive analysis sessions. So let me give you an example of a simple workflow. Like here, we specify the dimensions of a scatter plot. This is the first step. The second step is we brush outliers. And so now we have like selected these elements. And if we now store this by ID, we could like say, filter out this element. And now we have filtered out the outliers of this data set. And that's great. It's useful. But again, it's not very robust to any changes. And so if I were to add these red points, even if I had created these brushes not by ID, but by ranges, I would miss certain points. But like if I had like a function in a computer program that detected outliers, we could just do this, right? We wouldn't have to bother with that. And so that's where this idea comes in. Like we want to redefine the workflows by including the semantic information. So here again, like if you want to capture a semantic workflow, we first specify dimensions, then we brush a selection, then we refine the selection to select outlier using kind of the approach that I showed you earlier. So now we know semantically this is supposed to be selecting outliers. Then we filter it out. And now we have another workflow that is, however, robust to updates or changes. So here, if we had this other data set here with the new data points, which are both in the non-outlier and in the outlier space, we could simply reapply this workflow. And we would have like our initial brush, and we would have like the selection of outliers and then filtering out the outliers. And this would successfully apply our interactive workflow to this updated data set. And so that's just actually quite interesting and like a great result. And so how can we do this in practice? In practice, we're building like this prototype here, and I'm showing you like the first pieces here, but this is still work in progress. So the first thing we do is we show you like two different versions of a data set. So here, like we have a changed data set where these little comments on the left indicate that this point of this group of clusters has moved down, red points have been removed, and blue points have been added. And so clearly we see this data set has changed significantly, but the underlying patterns are still roughly the same, right? And then we can, like, if we understand that we want to have a cluster, we can track a selected cluster. So we can have like the cluster selected before and the cluster selected after. And then eventually we can select a particular cluster on a changed data set. And now I'm going to show you like a video where like this is all like well narrated, and I'm just going to play the audio to that. And I'm happy to like talk about this later more. So here's our video. Or maybe let
Here,
me just say this before. The other thing that is really cool about this idea is that you can use, like if you have these semantic workflows, you can actually use this to store or to integrate interactive visual analysis with computational analysis. So imagine you could kind of open up like a visualization and do some complicated process such as grouping points or filtering out points based on like an interactive visual analysis session that is then smart and robust to updates. We could store that in like a workflow database, and then we could call that particular function from this workflow database in a computational notebook. So we could kind of like use the best of both worlds and use this also to integrate between computational workflows and interactive workflows. And now to the video.
here we see a scatterplot
Can you
of
all
a
hear the
dataset
audio?
showing clusters. Our goal is to remove the top cluster. We can interact with the scatterplot by brushing a region to select a group of points. The system calculates predictions and suggests refinements for our selection. We can hover over the different suggested predictions and compare the results to our selection. The first prediction best matches our intention of selecting the cluster, so let's select that. We then filter out our selection. We see that all our interactions are tracked in a provenance graph. The provenance graph shows all the actions executed and on which versions of a dataset they were made on. Let's go back to our cluster selection in the provenance graph. We can load an updated version of the dataset and turn on the compare mode to see what has changed and how our selections are applied to this dataset. The compare mode shows the changes between the datasets, such as points that are added, removed, or changed, along with changes to our selection. We see that in this case, the selected cluster shifts a little. We can also see that our smart selection has perfectly captured the moving cluster. When dataset change, it's important for humans to review the changes our system recommends. We can record that the update is correct by verifying the interactions for this version of the dataset and create a workflow. To create a workflow, we first add a new workflow in the workflow editor and name it filter out cluster. We extract the actions based on the filter node. This automatically adds all the interactions that the filter action depends on and populates the workflow for us. Now let's look at a more complex situation. We switch to a new version of the dataset. Here our original cluster has broken up into two smaller clusters. We can see that the system has automatically selected a cluster which includes both small clusters and filters that out. We want to refine the selection to just include the top cluster, so we reject the filter and cluster selection interactions. Based on the rectangular brush, the top prediction accurately selects the smaller cluster, so we apply it and then filter it out. Now let's take a look at how we can bridge between interactive and computational workflows. We have loaded an outlier dataset which has a lot of outliers and we want to filter them out. We switch to the paintbrush and roughly select a few outliers. The top outlier suggestion selects all the outliers correctly, so we apply the suggestion and filter it out. In the compare view, we can verify that our selection is applied correctly to an updated dataset, so we create a workflow. We can click on the Share button, which stores the workflow to the workflow database, and then copy the workflow ID. Now let's look at how we can use the workflow in a Jupyter notebook. The notebook loads our reapply library and loads an updated dataset. We then load the workflow using the ID we copied. We can print the name and description of the workflow to verify that it's the correct one. The description shows the individual actions in the workflow. Then we apply the workflow to the target dataset by passing it to the apply function and extract the result. Applying the workflow on a new dataset shows a warning, indicating that the workflow hasn't been reviewed. We can do this review by clicking the provided URL, which automatically loads this version of the dataset in the interactive visualization. We verify that the interactions are applied properly and sync our workflow with the workflow database. Now, if we go back to the Jupyter notebook and rerun the cells for loading and reapplying the workflow, the warning goes away. We plot the dataset to verify and it looks good. We can now continue further analysis from here. Please review the paper for more details on our technique. Thank you for watching our video.
Okay, so this is kind of like a first step towards what I call literate visualizations. Here we have semantic selections and annotations, which allow us to have higher level information about events in an analysis process. It also gives analysts the means to justify their choices through annotations. It makes it a lot easier to build analysis stories and retrieve important states. And overall, it's also like possible now, based on this technology, to reuse visual analysis process just like functions in the program. And I'm very excited about this work, and I'm like really curious where this will lead eventually. And with that, I just want to conclude, and I'm happy to take questions. I just want to thanks to all the collaborators that really made this work possible. Okay, happy to take questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for the talk. It was really, exciting to see where your brain is already ahead of the projects that we have. I always try to map this on the projects that we currently have, and how do you deal with the situation that when the data gets completely updated in a way that you cannot find the patterns anymore? Do you recognize the situation? I mean, is there a way to say, okay, this is so messed up now, I cannot reapply, or do you rely on the user to evaluate the process?
Yeah, so we need the user to reevaluate the process. It's of course meant like if the data changes radically and not just like elements shift around a little bit or are added and removed, you would probably have to make changes, right? And then your conclusions might also change, right? So like if your data was wrong and you find that something changes significantly, it impacts your conclusions, you would have to look over it again. You had to review it, you might have to reject it, you might come to a different conclusion at the end of the day. And so there's certainly limits, but I do think that the case of like slight changes as data is being updated and added is actually very common. So like data, like dynamically, like most projects are actually dynamic, right? It's ongoing. So in the suicide study that I mentioned at the beginning, this is an ongoing project, and unfortunately people keep killing themselves. There's like 500 suicide cases a year in Utah. And so the database is regularly updated. And so this way you wouldn't expect that the patterns completely break, but that the new elements kind of fit with the rest of the data. And if it doesn't, that's actually also quite interesting, right?
Yeah, you're right. If it really completely breaks, you will have to withdraw the things that you did anyway.
Yeah. Let's see, Holger has his hand raised.
Yes, I also have a question. So thanks, really exciting to see the new release. So I want to know if so you showed that the workflow, that you can update the workflow, and it's probably more a technical question. Do you store each, let's say, version or like a provenance track of these workflows so that you know that you applied this workflow already on dataset version 1 and 2, and then you have a third version, and then you had to make an update so that you somehow either can go back or know how the workflow has changed over time? So do you store this, or do you just update it and that's it?
So this is like a technical detail, which Kieran might be better equipped to answer. Maybe Zach can pitch in. But I'm gonna say that yes, we store which data set a workflow has been applied to and whether it has been approved or rejected for the workflow. Zach, do you want to add anything?
If I understood the question correctly, you're asking if we're storing an actual history of kind of the order that we apply workflows in. In that sense, it's not as formal as like an actual like provenance graph. Like you don't have a history of, you don't have an actual order or anything like that. But as Alex said, yeah, we do keep track of what actual data sets we've applied a workflow to.
And I assume you also, for each of these workflow versions, let's say it like this, if you make changes to your workflow, you also store if you have to modify the brush, add another brush region, and so on. So I assume this is also stored there, but it's just hidden to the user. Okay.
We don't currently store different workflows for different versions, right? We like assume that like the work, like we assume that essentially data updates sequentially, and so like we always have like the latest version of the workflow, and we store which data sets that is like valid for. We could also store the workflow for each data set in addition to that, but we haven't done that yet.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Alex,
yeah.
I have a question. Have you conceptually considered how it would work if you apply the workflows to streaming data?
I haven't considered it yet. I would say that would be a really good use case, because like you can do something on the data you have, and then you can see where does the new data come in. You have much smarter selections, right? So I think for streaming data, this would be quite exciting, actually.
Yeah, it would be like, hey, there's a new outlier coming in. All right, further questions?
Moritz, I can see you talk, but I don't hear you.
Yeah, Moritz, you're on mute.
No, is it working now?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the first brush selection, where you perform the rectangle brush, you showed us a list of recommendations, basically cluster probability with associated with another selection. And how is this list computed?
So let me go back to the slides. So the list is computed by using any of the, like first we run these predictions. Like we essentially run all of these algorithms with many different configurations on the input data. And so then we have like, let's say we have like k-means in like with these parameters has generated a cluster that contains all of those 5 points, right? And then we match that to the selection of the user, to this part here, by comparing, by using like different measures. Most importantly, the Jakar distance, which is just like a measure of set similarity. We also do some like alternatives. We use like an AX Bayes classifier. And we also use some heuristic measures because some of our predictions don't as nicely fit into this framework. And we also have like a like slightly modified Jakar distance for autocomplete versus for capturing intent. But this gets now into like very subtle details. But then essentially we have this ranking based on the scores of the Jakar or any other distance measure. And then the user can select which one does match with their intent or their plan. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Further questions? Maybe I add one. So if you think of bigger operations, like bigger data sets that are processed in a notebook, do you think the approach would scale, or would there be any limitations that you expect? So what could be like limitations that you could observe in that case? Would it be the complexity of the workflows, or would it be the complexity of the data, or what do you think?
You know, like in terms of scalability, like one issue is higher dimensionality. Because if you have higher dimensions and you want to also select patterns in higher dimensions, which is also conceptually hard for humans to do based on visualizations, like right now we limit ourselves to the combinations of 2 dimensions that are visible or all dimensions in the data set. But we could in theory have all permutations of all possible dimensions as well, right? and that gets super complicated, like super computationally expensive, like very quickly. And so that would be like a challenge. Also, if we have very large data sets, like we do these predictions in a pre-processing step. And on smaller data sets, this is fairly quick, right? But we actually run very brute force here. We run k-means with like all kinds of parameterizations, right? And then pick, like use the ranking and some deduplication and so on to predict those patterns. But if you have a very large data set, this is maybe like gonna take a little bit of time. So you would have to kind of like, I think you can probably still do it, especially if you're not like, like if you're uploading a terabyte of data right now and then want to run this, that's gonna not work, right? But if you upload a terabyte of data and then like have a day of pre-processing, then something like this is still gonna work.
Yeah, but maybe for tackling this higher dimensionality problem, you could then work with embeddings that determine the position in the scatter plot instead of having just 2 of the dimensions on the axis.
Exactly. This is on our to-do list. We want to look at embeddings. We also want to look at additional visualization techniques, at additional data types. For example, networks. We like it actually, like for example, if we use something like lineup, a ranking tool, you have some different operations, right? You can, like, if you rank by a column in lineup, and then select the first 3 elements, you have an operation that we don't have in scatter plots, right? You're selecting the highest 3 elements and so on. And so there's like some extensions that you definitely can come up with or have to come up with if you extend this to other data types, to other data sets, and so on.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, last call for questions. If not, then let's thank Alex again. So
thank you, everyone.
And yeah, so this was the start of the lecture series that we also announced publicly. So we have 1 guest today. That's great. Yeah, I think I can close the session. Thanks, Alex, again. And we're going to do a short break and then continue with the SureFix.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.